Nobody picture a freezing night in the English countryside. January 1993. A quiet village where everyone knows everyone's name. A teenage girl, fresh into her 16th year, walking a familiar route home through gathering darkness. By 6:20 that evening, she was gone, not missing, not lost, murdered, and the person who killed her would walk free for 2 decades, living in plain sight, attending the victim's funeral, shaking hands with her grieving parents, speaking casually with the detectives hunting him. He would see his own face in newspapers about the case. He would read about the manhunt, and he would do it all, while his father destroyed the evidence. His mother protected his secrets, and the entire community unknowingly harbored a killer in their midst. For 21 years, justice seemed impossible. There was no forensic evidence, no weapon, no eyewitness who could point to a face with certainty. What authorities had was a brutal crime, a frightened community, and a mystery that would haunt an entire region for more than 2 decades. When the truth finally emerged, it came not from traditional detective work, but from a prison conversation that someone remembered years later, a tattered newspaper kept like a war trophy, and a new law that had changed everything about how courts could judge a defendant's character. This is the story of how one of Britain's most notorious cold cases was solved. And it's also a story about how the system that protected a killer for so long can teach us all something vital about community, vigilance, and the importance of speaking up when something doesn't feel right. Section 1. The girl who should have had everything. Claire arrived in the world in 1976. She was the only child born to Cliff and Linda Tiltman, parents who adored her completely. Growing up in Stone, a quiet pocket of southeastern England, where families had lived for generations alongside one another, Claire became the kind of person who made the place feel more vibrant just by existing in it. Her friends described her with words like radiant, warm, and magnetic. She had this quality that drew people toward her. Nobody in school photos from Dartford Grammar, she's captured mid-laugh, eyes bright. The type of teenager who looked like she had her whole life mapped out in front of her in beautiful detail. Her real friends, the ones closest to her, knew her as Tilts, and they knew her as someone fiercely loyal, quick with humor, and absolutely unafraid to be authentic. She loved music with the kind of passion only teenagers can muster. Queen, New Kids on the Block. She danced, she dreamed. She attended fire station open days because she had this calling to become a firefighter, a real vocation, something that meant something to her beyond just a job. Her parents supported that dream completely. They were the kind of parents who showed up, who believed in their daughter, who gave her space to grow even as they held her close. As an only child, Claire had cultivated something special with her parents. Not the distant, formal relationship some families build, but something genuine. Friends of the family said they'd never seen a closer bond. Her parents were her heroes, and she didn't hide that. She showed it. She said it. She lived it. By January 1993, Claire was 16, a milestone. 4 days past her 16th birthday, on a Monday evening, her parents made a parental decision that most would consider wise and measured. They allowed her more independence. She wanted to walk to her friend's house, a short distance, a familiar route. A reasonable request from a girl who was growing up. They said yes. Section 2. The attack nobody saw coming. Around 6:15 in the evening on January 18, 1993, Claire left her home on Woodward Terrace. She stopped at a local shop to buy cigarettes. The light was already gone from the sky. It was that kind of winter darkness that comes early and feels permanent. The streets were empty. The alley near Ivy Bower Surgery on the London Road was the kind of place most people would avoid after dark, the kind of narrow passage between buildings where shadows collect and sound dies. Somewhere in that darkness between 6:15 and 6:30, Claire was attacked. 9 stab wounds, some penetrating over 6 inches deep. The violence was methodical. It wasn't the chaotic rage of a mugging or a robbery. It was deliberate. It was focused. It was the work of someone who had planned this, who had thought about it, who knew what he was doing. 2 men driving past on London Road noticed something unusual on the side of the road. A figure, kneeling, struggling to breathe. They pulled over immediately. What they found changed everything they thought they knew about safety and randomness and the night. A girl, bleeding, gasping. The initial reaction was confusion. A car accident? But when they laid her down and the light caught her properly, the reality became unavoidable. This wasn't an accident. This was violence. This was intentional harm. One man held her hand. Another ran to a nearby pub and dialed 999 within minutes. Emergency services flooded the location. Paramedics took over CPR. But they cut away her clothing searching for injuries. They found 9 separate wounds. They fought to save her, but at 7:00 in the evening, just 4 days after celebrating her 16th birthday, Claire Tiltman was pronounced dead at the hospital. The news moved through the community like a shockwave. By the next morning, the story was on the front pages of national newspapers. Reporters were asking why. How could this happen? Who would do this? The community responded with hundreds of floral tributes placed at the alley. Police sealed off the area, and Kent police launched what would become one of the largest investigations in the force's modern history. They called it Operation Artist. Nobody Section 3, the investigation that went nowhere. What followed were weeks of exhaustive police work that ultimately hit wall after wall. More than 2,500 statements collected, nearly 1,500 witnesses interviewed, 40,000 documents processed and filed. 20,000 individuals entered into the investigative database. Every corner of the area was searched, every possibility was followed, and yet the evidence remained frustratingly sparse. No murder weapon was ever found despite police searching the entire neighborhood thoroughly. No fingerprints, no DNA evidence that could point to a culprit. No robbery, which meant this wasn't about theft or desperation. But several witnesses reported seeing a man in a light-colored jacket walking near the pedestrian crossing around the time of the attack. But in a densely populated area, that description matched hundreds of people. Thousands maybe. Police developed a working theory. This wasn't a random attack by a stranger who had wandered in from outside. This was someone Claire knew, someone from the community. The attack was too focused, too controlled. There was no chaos. There was no panic, just violence delivered with purpose. But knowing the killer was local and actually proving it were two completely different things. 2 days after Claire's murder, police received a phone call. A man saying he'd been in the area on the evening of the attack. He said he'd seen someone with dark curly hair near the pedestrian crossing around 6:30. Police recorded the information, they conducted an interview, they listened and documented everything. A week later, the same man called back. His story had shifted. Now he claimed he'd seen someone walking on London Road between 50:45 and 5:05. No mention of the pedestrian crossing anymore. He explained that he'd been out with his mother, who was a local counselor, delivering leaflets. The timeline had changed. The location had changed. The details had reorganized themselves in ways that seemed convenient to him. But no detective flagged this as suspicious enough to pursue. Nobody Section 4, mourning while the killer walked free. The funeral service for Claire was held at Elam Crematorium in southeast London. Over 200 people came to say goodbye. School friends, relatives, members of the Royal British Legion. These were people who had sung Happy Birthday to Claire less than 2 weeks earlier. Now they were here to bury her. Detectives scattered themselves throughout the crowd, watching, observing, hoping someone might reveal themselves through body language or behavior. After the service, at the reception held at the local Legion Club, Claire's mother Linda spoke to reporters. She said something that would later prove prophetic. She said she kept looking around the room, wondering if her daughter's killer was there. Nobody wondering if he was standing among the people mourning, wondering if he was playing a role while his victim's family grieved. She had a feeling, she said, a strong feeling. A mother's intuition that told her the person who destroyed their family was present in that room, shaking their hands, expressing condolences, wearing a mask. She was right. But it would take the better part of a generation to prove it. Back home in Stone, Cliff and Linda Tiltman created a kind of shrine to their daughter's memory. Her final school photograph, a certificate from the fire station recognizing her volunteer work, a picture of the first detective assigned to the case. Year after year, Claire's school friends sent Christmas cards. The community kept her name alive through repeated memorial services. But time was moving forward. Justice was not. In 2003, someone pulled Claire's memorial plaque from the wall on London Road, an act of vandalism without explanation, without motive, without any clear reason except perhaps cruelty. The community responded with outrage. The vandalism seemed to strengthen their resolve. They would not let her be forgotten. Linda Tiltman, the woman who had stood at her daughter's funeral, certain the killer was among them, died of cancer in March 2008. She was 56 years old. 15 years had passed since Claire was murdered. 15 years of living with the knowledge that the person who destroyed her family was still out there, still walking around, still living a life. Linda didn't get to see justice. Cliff continued on alone, the sole surviving parent. In 2012, he appeared on national television. He spoke about hope, about loss, about the weight of unanswered questions. He said his daughter would have been 35 by then. He said he missed her terribly. He said he tried to stay strong but would sometimes find a place to hide and cry for hours. 6 months later, Cliff died at the age of 62. 2 years before the case would finally break. Section 5, the friends Obuesho refused to let go. While Claire's parents fought their private battle against time and grief, 3 of her closest friends, Joanne Roberts, Vicky Atkins, and Lisa Gribben, waged their own kind of war. They created something called the Justice for Claire campaign. They organized an annual candlelit walk that retraced the exact path Claire had walked on the evening she died, from her home on Woodward Terrace, past the shop where she bought cigarettes, to the dark alley on London Road where she was killed. Not once, not twice, but every single year for nearly 2 decades. The walk became a community event. On the 20th anniversary in 2013, hundreds of people participated. The Prime Minister of Britain, David Cameron, added his voice to the call for information. Lisa stood before the gathered crowd and spoke about bringing Claire's name back into the light, about refusing to let her become just another cold case file gathering dust in a police station. Every year, these 3 women kept Claire's memory alive. Every year, they walked that route. Every year, they carried photographs of Cliff and Linda Tiltman with them. They refused to accept that this case was unsolvable. Section 6, The Killer's Secret Life. While the community was mourning and fighting for justice, there was a man living in Swanscombe, a town right next to Greenhigh, who seemed completely normal. His name was Colin Ash Smith. He was born in 1968. His father, Aubrey, was a counselor. His mother, Diana, was also a counselor and had served as a mayor. On the surface, this was a respectable family. The kind of family that nobody would ever suspect of harboring darkness. The kind of family that blended into the background of small-town England. Ash Smith worked as a milkman, a job that took him along every road in the area multiple times per week. He knew the geography intimately. He knew which streets had witnesses, which alleyways were dark, which routes people took when walking alone. But inside his home, he maintained a collection of 20 to 30 knives. Serious knives, not kitchen implements. Weapons. He also owned a crossbow, an air rifle, an air pistol, a fake Magnum handgun. A milkman didn't need weapons like these, but someone preparing for something else would. From the time he was 19 or 20 years old, Ash Smith developed a habit. He would wait until his parents were asleep. Then he would sneak out into the night carrying a knife. He called these his midnight walks, and he described them in his own words as a search. He hoped, he said, that he would encounter someone, and that person would provoke him into attacking them. These weren't the words of someone seeking self-defense. These were the words of someone hunting, someone looking for an opportunity, someone fantasizing about violence. From the late 1980s onward, Ash Smith kept a diary. And in that diary, he recorded his attacks and his attack plans with chilling specificity. There was an entry about a 1988 attack on a woman. He described it as a masterpiece and rated it 95% successful. When he later learned the woman had survived, he wrote simply, "Next time I'll do better." There was an entry about an attempted home invasion that he labeled a completely pathetic failure. Don't want to talk about it. And then there was the entry that investigators would later call the coldest piece of evidence in the entire file. My friend Joe Kingley calls me the Swanscombe psycho, but they never suspect anything. I finally got away with it. I even called the police and told them some details about the attack. I also said if the victim described me, I would kill a schoolgirl. The diary was a window into the mind of someone who had crossed from fantasy into action, someone who was hunting, someone who was planning, someone who was absolutely certain he would not be caught. Section 7, another attack, another chance. On October 17, 1995, 2 years after Claire's murder, Ash Smith attacked again. This time the victim was Charlotte Barnard. Nobody. She was walking under a bridge called the Arches in Greenhigh when Ash Smith grabbed her, dragged her across the road, and stabbed her multiple times. Charlotte screamed. Charlotte fought back, and somehow she survived. She fell to her knees screaming, and he walked away as if nothing had happened. A witness saw his car, a distinctive white Ford Capri, the car of a local milkman, the car of a man who had been interviewed about Claire's case but released due to lack of evidence. This time, police had a crime scene. This time, they had a victim who could speak. This time, they had a witness who had seen the vehicle. When they searched his house and car, they found the knife used in the 1995 attack. They found the diary. They found half a school tie in the Ford Capri used to restrain the 1988 victim years earlier. They found blood-stained clothing. Evidence was suddenly everywhere. On December 20, 1996, Ash Smith was sentenced to 3 life terms for the 1988 and 1995 attacks. But he maintained absolute silence about Claire. Not involved, he said. Didn't know her, nothing to say. What police would later discover was that just before his house was searched in connection with Claire's case, his father Aubrey had boiled one of Colin's knives, disassembled it piece by piece, and disposed of it. In 1997, Aubrey was sentenced to 12 months in prison for perverting the course of justice. The judge stated plainly in his ruling that this action raised serious questions about Colin's involvement in Claire's murder. Section 8, 21 years of waiting. For nearly 2 decades, Ash Smith sat in prison. His convictions were solid for 1988 and 1995. But Claire's case remained technically unsolved. The evidence was circumstantial. The case seemed unsolvable. And then something shifted. The British Parliament passed a new law. In 2003, the Criminal Justice Act took effect. It allowed juries, for the first time, to hear about a defendant's prior bad character and previous convictions in a trial. Before this law, Ash Smith's history of violence could not have been presented to a jury in a trial for Claire's case. After it, everything changed. But even with this new legal framework, prosecutors needed more evidence. They needed something concrete. That something came from an unlikely source. In 2001, Ash Smith was sharing a prison cell at Wakefield Prison with a man named Stephen Dubois. They talked as prisoners do about life, about their cases, about the things that preoccupied them in the dark hours of incarceration. And at some point, Ash Smith mentioned something about an attack, about a pedestrian crossing, about anger, about being near a pedestrian crossing and exploding. Stephen listened. He remembered. But he didn't immediately understand the significance. He thought Ash Smith might be talking about one of the crimes he'd already been convicted of. But when Stephen thought about it more carefully, there was no pedestrian crossing near the locations of the 1988 or 1995 attacks. There was, however, a pedestrian crossing right next to the alley on London Road in Greenhigh. The exact location where Claire had walked before stepping into darkness. Stephen didn't report the conversation at the time. He carried it with him for years, not fully understanding what he'd heard. It wasn't until 2013, when police reactivated the cold case review and contacted him directly, that he gave an official statement about what Ash Smith had said to him in that cell. Section 9, the trophy. In September 2013, Kent Police's cold case unit conducted something they hadn't done thoroughly before. They searched the old family home at 14 Myrtle Place in Stone, Dartford. It was intensive, methodical. Neighbors watched as evidence bags were carried out of the house. Inside that house, investigators found something that seemed almost too perfect to be true. A newspaper, a local newspaper marking the one-year anniversary of Claire's death. And it wasn't a newspaper that had been carelessly left in a drawer. It had been kept carefully, preserved, kept deliberately. Ash Smith had maintained that newspaper all those years, even while serving time for other crimes. He had kept it like a trophy, like a souvenir of something he was proud of. This is the behavior pattern of certain offenders. The ones who want to relive their crimes, the ones who want to keep mementos. Nobody, the ones who replay what they did in their minds and want something tangible to anchor that replaying to. With Stephen's testimony about the pedestrian crossing and this newspaper kept as a trophy, the file finally became strong enough. On February 12, 2014, a prosecutor announced that there was sufficient evidence to charge Colin Ash Smith with the murder of Claire Tiltman. The timing was almost theatrical. Ash Smith was due to appear before the parole board the very next day. He was potentially going to be released, to walk out a free man, but the cold case investigation that had followed him for 2 decades caught him at the last possible moment. Section 10. Trial and verdict. The trial began in November 2014, 21 years to the month after Claire was murdered. But nobody at Inner London Crown Court. Prosecutor Brian Altman QC outlined the case methodically. He described Ash Smith as a ruthless predator who attacked his chosen victim quickly and without mercy, giving her no time to defend herself or escape. He said Ash Smith derived twisted pleasure from the brutality, that this was murder for the sake of murder itself. The prosecution built its case in layers. Stephen's testimony about the pedestrian crossing detail that only matched Claire's case. The newspaper kept as a trophy through the years. The phone call made on January 19th, the day after the murder, placing Ash Smith in the area at the exact time of the offense. The light-colored jacket he wore on the night he killed Claire, and again at her funeral, matching witness descriptions. The pattern of attacks, all 3 crimes occurring within the same small radius, all targeting women walking alone, all using knives with no clear financial motive. And finally, the diary. The diary with detailed attack fantasies. The diary with rankings of his own crimes. The diary with statements about wanting to hurt women. This was the evidence the 2003 law had made possible. Before this law, the jury would never have heard any of it. Ash Smith took the witness stand in his own defense. He admitted his midnight walks. He admitted carrying knives since his late teens. He admitted to the 1988 and 1995 attacks. He said he wanted to feel empowered, that he wanted to have control over someone that he felt walked over in his regular life and wanted to reverse that dynamic. But regarding his attitude toward women, he said coldly, "I don't like them because I feel they have power over me. I feel worthless." Low self-esteem, not confident. Regarding his strange behavior after Claire's murder, he said that when he heard how much pain her death had caused her parents, he wanted to kill whoever had killed her. that he was just sad like everyone else. But his defense was weak against the accumulation of evidence. When asked about the pedestrian crossing detail he'd allegedly mentioned to Stefan, his story began to collapse, because that detail made sense in only one context, only one location, only one crime, the alley on London Road in Greenhigh. After 5 weeks of trial, the jury deliberated for 3.5 hours. On December 11, 2014, they returned with their verdict. Guilty. Ash Smith showed no emotion, just the same indifference he'd maintained throughout the entire trial. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 21 years. 21 years, the same number of years he'd lived free after murdering Claire. Section 11, the legacy that remains. Cliff and Linda Tiltman did not live to see justice. They had requested many years earlier that their ashes not be buried with Claire until her killer was found. They wanted to remain separate. They wanted to wait. They wanted justice before rest, but they both died before the trial, before the verdict, before the sentence. They never got to hear the word guilty spoken in court. But after the conviction was secured, that request was finally honored. The ashes of Cliff and Linda Tiltman were placed with their daughter. The family was reunited in death, if not in justice. 3 friends attended every single day of that trial: Joanne Roberts, Vicky Atkins, and Lisa Gribben. Lisa flew down from Scotland to attend the entire 5-week trial. They brought photographs of Cliff and Linda with them each day, so Claire's parents could be present in spirit, so they could bear witness. After the verdict, the Justice for Claire campaign issued a statement. It had been nearly 22 years, they said. 22 years since a 16-year-old girl with dreams of becoming a firefighter was taken from the world. 22 years since a community's innocence was shattered. We will never understand why, they said. The campaign officially closed after the conviction. The website came down. The goal had been achieved. The annual candlelit walks ended. The memorial had been completed. Justice, incomplete as it was, had finally arrived. Section 12, the lessons ended in this tragedy. The case of Claire Tiltman teaches critical lessons that extend far beyond a single village in England. Lessons that apply to communities everywhere. To America, to your town, to the street where you live. The first lesson is about listening to instinct. Claire's mother stood at her daughter's funeral and knew. She felt it. She had a mother's intuition that screamed at her. But instinct is not evidence. Feeling is not proof. Nobody. So when you observe someone in your community behaving strangely after a crime, when you notice someone inserting themselves into an investigation, when you see someone volunteering to help the victim's family, when you watch someone show up at funerals where they don't belong, report it. You don't need absolute proof. You just need to observe and communicate what you've observed to authorities. You just need to pick up the phone. The second lesson is about the danger of silence within families. Ash Smith's parents knew their son carried knives. They knew about his midnight walks. They chose not to confront it. They chose not to report it. They chose silence. And when their son was suspected of murder, his father actively destroyed evidence. His mother covered for him. But that family's silence allowed a killer to operate for decades. In America, if you have information about an unsolved crime, you can reach out to Crime Stoppers. 1-800-222-8476. Call anonymously. Provide information. Potentially receive a reward. The third lesson is about communication and vulnerability. Claire walked less than a mile to her friend's house. It was a familiar route, a short distance. Her parents didn't know exactly which way she went. A single text message, a quick communication about her route, about where she was going, about how long she'd be, could have shortened response time in an emergency, could have made a difference. These lessons are simple, but they're critical. And they're embedded in the story of a girl who should have had everything, who should have become a firefighter, who should have had a family, who should have had a life, but who instead became a name on a memorial plaque, a rose planted in her memory, a street renamed in her honor, a tragedy that a community refused to let be forgotten.